Let's see, you know John Deutsch over there.
Oh, yes.
And John White.
Let's see.
Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Ash Carter of the Kennedy School, and it's my privilege to introduce this panel on Korea, Prospects for Peace on the Peninsula, and we couldn't have chosen a better week. Elections going on in the Republic of Korea, and a very dramatic announcement earlier this week that President Kim Dae-jung of the Republic of Korea and Kim Jong-il, Marshal Kim Jong-il of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, have agreed to meet in a summit in June. All of this, all of these events on the Korean Peninsula choreographed so that they could coincide with the Kennedy School's forum this evening. And for that, we're very grateful to all the parties in the region, particularly to the able ambassadors who saw to that choreography. We are going to focus on the security situation on the Korean Peninsula. That, in turn, however, is heavily influenced by the economic situation, both in the south and in the north. So we will extend our discussion to that as well. Let me just remind you all, particularly those who are not experts on the Korean Peninsula, of the security situation there. There is no peace treaty ending the Korean War of 47 years ago. There is an armistice, no peace. Along the demilitarized zone separating the north and south, about 1 million DPRK troops arrayed very close to the border, some 11,000 or so artillery tubes trained on Seoul and its suburbs, ballistic missiles trained on Seoul and indeed the entire Korean Peninsula. Facing that DPRK army along the Cold War's last existing armed frontier, a very large and capable Republic of Korea force, combined with an American force in a combined command, any given day, 37,000 American soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines in that force on the peninsula, and many more would reinforce them in the event that war came. Should war come to the Korean Peninsula, God forbid, this is no desert storm. This isn't a conflict that takes place out in a desert somewhere where no one lives. This is a conflict that takes place in the suburbs of a teeming modern city, in a densely populated area, and there would be many, many, many thousands of people killed. Americans, South Koreans, North Koreans. For the United States, this would be the most intense combat American forces have seen since the last Korean War. So this is no joke. Everyone's estimates, and General Talleli can comment on this, are that that war would end relatively quickly. Though bloody, it would end surely in a victory by the combined forces of the United States and South Korea and other participants. It would result in the destruction of the armed forces of North Korea. I believe that North Korea knows that. I also believe that we know that it would be one hell of a destructive war. And in that sense, deterrence is strong in the Korean Peninsula. And this situation, while not particularly desirable by any means, is relatively stable. However, various factors intervene to make a situation that would otherwise be unsatisfactory but stable, potentially unstable, and foremost among them is the introduction by North Korea of ballistic missiles of increasing range and continuing concerns about a possibly continuing nuclear weapons program in North Korea. These are the kinds of developments that could rapidly destabilize an already dangerous situation. That happened once before. The year was 1994, and you'll all recall that summer. That was a year I was serving in the Pentagon, and I fully expected that there was a reasonable chance that there would be a war on the Korean Peninsula in that year. That war, fortunately, was averted by the negotiation of the so-called agreed framework between the United States and the DPRK, according to which North Korea would cease its plutonium production-related activities at Yongbyon, and the United States, the ROK, and Japan would together provide North Korea with some light water reactors. That's what everybody thinks the agreement says, but if you read further on the agreement, it says other things. It says that eventually the United States and North Korea should normalize relations, should improve their economic relations, and so on, and that the relationship between the North and the South, and the talks between the North and the South should continue. Well, none of that happened, although the reactors are happening, thanks to Ambassador Bosworth's efforts, but war was averted in 1994. A lot has happened since then. And if the last time you tuned in to security affairs on the Korean Peninsula was 1994, you should note that it's a whole new ballgame. Why a whole new ballgame? Well, let's start with the economic front. South Korea has been through a rather dramatic dip, but is now on the mend. And the South Korean economy doing very well. Not so the North Korean economy. North Korean economy, industrial output down, who knows, maybe 80% or so relative to 1994. And very importantly and very tragically, a population unable to feed itself, only subsisting because of food assistance from the United States, China, and other countries. No one really knows how to count how large the number of victims is, but somewhere between 1 and 3 million citizens of the DPRK out of a population of 22 million has perished as a result of starvation or starvation-related illness in this period. Meanwhile, both North Korea and South Korea got new leaders. Kim Il-sung, founder of the North Korean state, died, his place taken by Kim Jong-il, who went through a protracted period of political pubescence, you might say, as he gradually took on the levers of power that his father had handled. So a new leader, and possibly now acting or able to act strategically in a way that he wasn't in the early years after 1994. In South Korea, President Kim Dae-jung, a man long in the opposition, a campaigner for democracy, and a leader who leans very far forward in terms of an opening to the North. So a very different situation than we had in 1994, but fully as dangerous today. Recently, there have been some very interesting signs, and this is what I think our distinguished panelists tonight can elucidate for us. First of all, talks between Japan and North Korea on their normalization of their relations and the putting behind them their animosities of the past. Second, and it was my privilege to participate in this, a policy review, the North Korea policy review, the so-called Perry process of the United States, of which I was senior advisor, and that has led to contacts between the United States and the DPRK, which not yet fully realized, are also in the offing. And most dramatically this week, the announcement by the Republic of Korea and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea that their two leaders will meet this summer. So a dangerous situation, the last Cold War hangover, but glimmers of hope. And this is the situation that our three distinguished panelists are going to illuminate for us. First speaking will be His Excellency Lee Hong-koo, who is the ambassador of the Republic of Korea to Washington. Ambassador Lee, besides being a wise individual, is an extremely experienced individual. Let me just tick off some of the offices he has occupied. Prime Minister, member of the Cabinet, chairman of a political party, the New Korea Party, participant in the Commission on Global Governance, in 1995, which recommended fundamental reforms of the United Nations, and my favorite one, chairman of the World Cup Bidding Committee, which brought the World Cup to Japan and the ROK. Very interesting combination of hosts for the World Cup. He also easily fits into the Kennedy School. He has an academic career as well, culminating in the presidency of the Korean Political Science Association. He also happens to be, like me, a Yale graduate, and that bespeaks quality. Ambassador Steve Bosworth. Next on my left, one of America's senior diplomats, previously ambassador to Tunisia and the Philippines, director of policy planning in the Department of State, later president of the U.S.-Japan Foundation, and executive director of KIDO, the organization charged with the implementation of the agreed framework. He is Mr. Reactor. If you want 2 light water reactors, ask Steve Bosworth. He knows how to get them. Now U.S. ambassador in Seoul. And finally, General John Tillelly, who's wearing no hat tonight, but he, up until 2 months ago, he wore 3 hats. They were Commander-in-Chief of the United Nations Command. Yes, the United Nations Command. If you don't remember that history from the 1950s, go back and read it. Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Forces Command of the Republic of Korea and the United States, and Commander of U.S. Forces in Korea. He has recently been named President and Chief Executive Officer of the USO, something which all of us who care about people in uniform are delighted he agreed to do. He served in the Army for 37 years, 22 of them outside of this country, in Vietnam, in Germany, in the Pentagon, which technically qualifies as being in the country, but in terms of his experience, it might have been different. He was the commander of the 1st Cavalry Division during Desert Shield and Desert Storm. He coordinated for the United States military planning for security at the Atlanta Olympics. So an officer of broad acquaintance with security problems in the world, and most recently, and for this evening's purposes, most importantly, the top military officer of the United States on the Korean Peninsula. Those are our 3 guests. Our format is as follows. Each of our 3 guests will make remarks, and then we'll be pleased to take your questions. Let me begin with Ambassador Lee.
Thank you very much, Professor Carter. It's always a pleasure to be at Harvard. Let me speak from the Korean perspective, and to help you to understand the general background. Looking back the 20th century, the Koreans suffered more than our share of problems, difficulties. In 1910, Korea was taken over by Japan and under Japanese rule for 35 years. In 1945, we found ourselves divided by the victorious forces. So this year marks 55th year of national division. So all along, we suffered. But we worked hard, and I think we have resolved a number of problems. Just like most other countries, we concentrated on 3 areas in the last few decades. One is, of course, to deal with the problem of division. For example, we have 5 million people came down from North Korea to South Korea. There are numerous security problems, which already Professor Carter had mentioned. So how to deal with the problem of division and move toward unification certainly is one area of national challenge. Second, economic development. We were quite poor. At the end of the Korean War, our per capita income was less than $100. So we have to get out of this, and we worked hard. And 5 years ago, we finally reached the point of $10,000 per capita income, literally 100-fold increase. We also had to work hard to achieve democracy. It was not easy, particularly when the effort for democratization was related to the efforts for economic development and to enhance our security, the whole equation became somewhat complicated. Now, 2 years ago, Kim Dae-jung became the president. To be exact, on December 18th, 1997. 2 weeks before that election, December 3rd, we were hit by the so-called Asian financial crisis. Suddenly, we found ourselves in a deep hole. In a matter of literally a few weeks, the country was in turmoil in economic sense. We were on the verge of bankruptcy. We were almost fully employed, but in a matter of a few weeks, we found 2 million people out of job. Exchange rate jumped from 900 to 1900. So the first task faced by Kim Dae-jung, who symbolized the fact that the process of democratization finally came to a successful end, the task Kim Dae-jung faced was to bring the country out of this serious economic crisis. He had worked hard. Most of all, the Korean people cooperated fully. And in the last 2 years, we have made a tremendous and remarkable recovery. It's really too good to be true, but that's the situation. In 1998, we had more than minus 6% contraction. Last year, we had more than 10% growth. In January 1998, our reserve was down to $3.9 billion. At the end of March, 10 days ago, we have approximately $86 billion in reserve. So all in all, the situation looked good. Of course, we have a still long way to go. There are a number of priorities in this field. First, we have to manage our macroeconomic policy wisely. Second, we have to continue and maintain dynamics for reform and restructuring. Without it, we cannot survive in this new era. We are particularly aware of the development of information technology. We think it's very well suited to Korea. Korea is a resource-poor country. We don't produce a single drop of oil. The only thing we have in abundance is educated population. I think we could mobilize it, and we could really challenge the leadership in the coming age of information technology. But we also have to work hard to maintain and improve social cohesiveness, economic development, particularly the restructuring, could create some problems in terms of equity. The gap between rich and poor could widen. So we have to take care of these problems. But above all, we are determined to become a very important member and participant in the global economy. We have decided to open our economy fully. We have got rid of many restrictions and hurdles which prevented foreigners from full participation in Korean economy. Last year alone, we had slightly more than $15 billion foreign direct investment in Korea. This is a good sign. With investment comes technology. So all in all, we have basically a very optimistic picture as far as our economy is concerned. Now, the third and most difficult part, how to deal with the national division problem. As I said, it's the 55th year. This year marks the 50th anniversary of Korean War. Nothing has changed very much in terms of confrontation. As we entered into 1990s, around the world, people were talking about post-Cold War era, not so in the Korean Peninsula. We still have to write the final chapter in the history of the Cold War. How are we going to do it? Now, the problem is North Korea. North Korea is a classic communist totalitarian system. In some sense, most successful experiment in building up a totalitarian political system. One party, one leader, one ideology, total disciplining of population, total isolation of population. It has succeeded to an extreme. And when you do that, you lose almost all or any capacity to make major changes. Everybody becomes prisoner of the system. Even if they wanted to make a change, it's very difficult to do so. However, the developments of the last few years have clearly indicated that without a major change, the system couldn't go on. Millions of people suffer from the shortage of food, medicine. We all know this. From our viewpoint, military solution is unthinkable. Every and all Koreans are determined not to have another war in the peninsula. Therefore, the only way we can move toward unification is through peaceful means, which means we have to talk with them, we have to persuade them, we have to negotiate with them. It's a very difficult process, but we need patience. And Kim Dae-jung set out to achieve that, so he put tremendous emphasis on engagement, so-called sunshine policy, and he really persistently and consistently propagated his position. It is really a somewhat expected, but in some sense unexpected outcome. That is, last Sunday, the North Koreans had agreed to have a summit between two leaders. Now, back in 1994, Professor Carter was mentioning a very dangerous period we had. As the solution began to emerge, there was an agreement to hold a summit between late Kim Il-sung and former President Kim Il-sung. I myself negotiated this summit at Panmunjom. Just 2 weeks before the summit, Kim Il-sung passed away. So from that point on, for the last 6 years, we had a real vacuum. And in that period, North Korea had experienced almost a free fall. After 6 years, after that interval, we're in a way coming back to the track. It is our hope that this momentous meeting in Pyongyang in June will mark the beginning of an end for the intense confrontation between North and South. And together we will move to building a commonwealth in Korea. We accept the existence of two state structures. Yet we see that we can together develop an economic community, cultural community, and social community, which will help all the citizens in the North and South. And in due course of time, we may find even political solution for unification, but we don't want to hurry. That's the basically philosophy shared by many and led by current President Kim Dae-jung. So with this background, Koreans have tremendous expectation for June meeting. Of course, having experienced all the disappointments in the past, we of course try to guard ourselves from making an excessive prediction or expectation. Nevertheless, we see these developments in a most positive way.
Thank you, Ambassador Lee. Next speaking will be Ambassador Bosworth. And Steve, if you would, among other things you say, address the U.S. government's view of this summit prospect, please.
Indeed. I'm nothing if not disciplined. It's a delight to be here. I'm always happy to be back in Boston. I went to a small school north of here in New Hampshire when it was still an all-male institution. And the occasional trips down to Boston seemed like a long march through a big desert to this oasis where there was female companionship. Let me talk a little bit about the U.S.-ROK relationship with particular focus on the events that have transpired in the course of the last week or so. First of all, for the United States, stability on the Korean Peninsula is an objective that really cannot be overemphasized, both for stability on the peninsula itself and for reasons having to do with the stability and security of Northeast Asia, a region of tremendous economic and strategic interest to the United States. For a long time following the Korean War, the North Korean, the stability on the peninsula was relatively solid. There was tension and a military standoff, but the Combined Force Command that Ash described earlier was a sufficient deterrent to assure that in practice and in fact, North Korea did not attempt to solve the division of the peninsula with military means. In the late 1980s and the early 1990s, that situation began to change in a rather dangerous fashion. And ironically, it began to change because North Korea became progressively weaker. And a weaker North Korea was therefore, in our view, more likely to be tempted at some point to use military measures to try to improve its strategic position. In the early 1990s, it became obvious that North Korea was embarked upon a nuclear weapons program. That program was frozen, as Dr. Carter explained, through the agreed framework of Geneva. In the 80s and early 90s, North Korea also accelerated its missile development program. It began deploying not just short-range missiles, but it began developing and preparing to deploy medium-range missiles, began exporting that missile technology into other areas of vital interest to the United States, including the Middle East. So that it became clear that deterrence by itself was no longer a sufficient strategy for the United States or for our ally on the Korean Peninsula. When President Kim Dae-jung was inaugurated in February of 1998, he immediately launched his Sunshine Policy. I'm not sure that was the most felicitous name he could have given to that policy. But if you examine it carefully, I think it is extremely balanced and it makes a great deal of sense. It has three sort of core principles, and let me just describe each of those briefly. The first principle is zero tolerance of military provocation, which is another way of saying that deterrence remains the foundation of strategy toward North Korea. And another way of saying that the U.S.-ROK alliance remains fundamental to South Korea's security. The second principle was a separation of business and politics. That was another way of saying that South Korean firms would be free to go to North Korea and explore possibilities for doing business there. And as we know, a number have done so. Many are operating on a very small scale in North Korea. At least one is operating on a very large scale. That's Hyundai with its tourism project at Kumgan Mountain. The rationale for that, it seems to me, makes eminently good sense, and that is that by creating economic connections between South and North Korea, one creates for North Korea a self-interest in stability. And it is a means of constraining North Korea, because they know that if they act in a provocative manner, that they put at risk the benefits that they are receiving from these economic connections. The third principle is that South Korea will not seek to undermine or absorb North Korea. Now, this is intended to reassure North Korea that the objective of this whole policy is not to try to bring down the regime. It also reflects I think, a change in basic public attitudes in South Korea toward the question of the division of the peninsula. In the aftermath of the German reunification, in the aftermath of South Korea's own economic crisis of 1997-98, I think there was a lessening of desire on the part of South Koreans to achieve reunification in the short term, and a desire rather to try to create a process which would lead step by step to a lowering of tensions, what one might describe as eventually a state of peaceful coexistence, at which time Koreans from North and South could sit down and decide and discuss how the eventual reunification of Korea might come about. In August of 1998, North Korea fired a long-range missile over Japan. It got Japan's attention, it certainly got our attention. As a result of that and some increased suspicions that the North Koreans might be still embarked upon a nuclear weapons program, President Clinton asked former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry to conduct an intensive review of U.S. policy, the one that Ash Carter was involved in and the one that he referred to earlier. In that review, we produced, in effect, a common strategy, common to the U.S., the ROK, and Japan. We have common objectives. Those are to address our concerns regarding North Korea's weapons of mass destruction and North Korea's missile program, and above all, to address the pressing need to bring about a lowering of tensions between North and South Korea through dialogue between the two of them. We agreed that each of us would seek to pursue these objectives in bilateral dialogues with North Korea. The prospect of North Korea ever agreeing to sit down and talk to us all collectively seemed, and still seems, remote. The U.S. and North Korea have had a dialogue underway for some time. It never really ended after the agreed framework negotiations. Progress has been very fitful and very difficult, but we have made some progress. We negotiated an agreement to look at a suspicious site in North Korea that we feared could house a nuclear-related facility. We have recently agreed that we will soon resume negotiations regarding the question of missiles. And of course, we, the United States, have constantly told North Korea that the only real solution to its economic problems lies in improving its relationship with South Korea. Japan last week began its dialogue with North Korea, aimed at normalization. The price of normalization from North Korea's perspective is probably going to be quite high, but at least the Japanese-North Korean dialogue is underway. The missing piece in all of this has been the most important piece, the ROK North Korean dialogue, which has to be the core of any concerted attempt to resolve over time in a meaningful fashion the problems of the Korean Peninsula. And that's why the announcement that was made on the weekend has been greeted so positively by the U.S. government. We recognize that this is only a beginning, that we have had promising developments before, only to find them frustrated by North Korea's behavior. But we have some expectation that this can begin to produce a meaningful dialogue between North Korea and South Korea. People ask, why now? Why has North Korea suddenly changed its position? I think the answer is complicated but relatively simple. First and foremost, it is that North Korea is desperate economically. And secondly, I think much has to do with the consistency with which Kim Dae-jung, his government, has pursued his engagement policy toward North Korea. And thirdly, I think it is very important that South Korea, Japan, and the U.S. have been visibly and effectively pursuing a coordinated strategy in which none of us is ever surprised by what happens. in which we continue to reassure each other that our goals remain unchanged and our objectives are going to continue to be shared objectives. But far and away, the most important element of this trilateral process is now going to be South-North dialogue. And we look forward very much to continuing the process of coordination, to supporting as is necessary and appropriate what South Korea is trying to do. And I think that the prospects don't look that dim. One should be very cautious about making judgments as to eventual success, however. North Korea is desperate. They need a lot, but survival remains their primary objective. So this has to be done very carefully and has to be done in a way that North Korea does not find overly threatening. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. The report to which Steve referred, the North Korea Policy Review report, I brought some copies down of that, and they'll be available up here for anybody who wants to read what was said as a result of that review, and you can also get them from my webpage if you want, where they're also posted, but there is a stack of them here. Our third panelist is General Tillelly, and John, if you would.
Thanks. Well, I'm happy to be here, and it's especially wonderful to sit on a panel with some old friends. As Ambassador Bosworth said earlier on, peace and stability in the Republic of Korea and in Northeast Asia is of vital interest to the United States of America. And our security environment in Northeast Asia as a whole is stronger as a result in the growth of the Republic of Korea. And the Republic of Korea is a linchpin from our perspective in that area of the world, key critical to the United States of America. The ROC and U.S. alliance is a unique and a model alliance. It is a mature partnership, a partnership based on mutual interests, a partnership based on peace and stability on the peninsula, and a partnership that is based on long-term friendships. Friendships among peoples and friendships among individuals. And in my mind's eye, having served in a lot of different places around the world, it is one of those unique places that you grow to love very quickly, and it takes a long time to forget those friendships, and you will never forget those friendships. The military alliance is also a very unique alliance in that the United States is committed militarily to the defense of the Republic of Korea. And each and every day on Korean soil, we have 37,000 men and women who serve these two great nations. Men and women of character far away from home who with their Korean counterparts serve our nation so well. It is a combined environment, and by combined I mean it's Korean soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, and U.S. soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines serving side by side for a common purpose. And currently their common purpose is to deter, if necessary, defend and fight and win. And behind that is the full commitment of the United States of America in a time of crisis or conflict. By any measure or any stretch or any matrix that one were to use, this alliance has been a success story in so many different ways. As Ambassador Lee said, this June 25th will be the 50th commemoration of the start of the Korean War. But since then, because of our strong alliance, peace and stability has been maintained. The firm stance of the two nations, the two military, has persisted in spite of consistent threats and provocations. The President of the Republic of Korea, Kim Dae-jung, upon his announcement of his engagement policy, announced that while attempting to engage, he will also continue to maintain this deterrence and strong defense. And it has yielded dividends, and I'll talk about those in a moment. Dividends that progressively are moving and have moved in the right direction. The current array of dialogue that we are talking about and have talked about, coupled with the readiness of our forces, has been a successful formula and will prove to be successful in the future. Ambassador Bosworth, in one of his speeches in the Republic of Korea, and this goes to show him I pay attention to what he said because he was my partner, said that the two countries have taken a calculated and patient approach that will yield success in the long term. And I think he's absolutely correct. Think about some of the things that have occurred since the agreed framework, the four-party talks, the general officer talks, the bilaterals between North Korea and a number of countries. We should be optimistic because communications is always better than confrontation. And at the same time we are optimistic, we should ensure that we have a strong defense and are together very vigilant to show that we are absolute in our commitment to one another. The agreed framework, with which Ambassador Bosworth was key, and the Dr. Perry policy review has further been an accelerant, if you will, or a catalyst to stimulate dialogue and developments that are positive. And these, again, are underpinned by defense, by a strong defense. At the same time, I think I would be remiss, since Ambassador Lee mentioned it, if I did not mention that even during the depths of the economic crisis in the Republic of Korea, the Republic of Korea provided national burden sharing to support the U.S. forces present on the peninsula. And they provided that burden sharing at a time when many said they could not do it, which showed that their strong commitment to the United States and the United States forces there. So I asked that for a moment, and you heard both Ambassador Lee and Ambassador Bosworth speak about it. For a moment, contrast the strength of this great alliance between the ROK and the United States with the North Korean situation and regime. A regime that promised to meet the needs of all the people only meets the needs of the very elite. One of the world's smallest economies supporting one of the world's largest militaries. And in fact, the people in North Korea suffer the paradox. The basic needs are not met: food, medicine. It's a welfare-based state that essentially, when you measure it against any economic matrix, has already collapsed. And in a real view, their last viable instrument of national power becomes their military, and they still remain dangerous. So I, as a former military individual who had the honor to serve in the Republic of Korea, I'm optimistic. I believe we are pursuing the correct direction in dialogue and the policies of President Kim Dae-jung as he underpins his engagement policy with a strong defense and a very capable, competent, and disciplined Republic of Korea forces remains the formula for success. I can say that the U.S. will continue our resolve with this alliance. We are resolute, and in fact, the United States interests demand it, and the Republic of Korea and its population not only expect it, but deserve it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, and thanks to all three of the panelists. I'm going to abuse the prerogative of the chair and ask a couple of questions to begin with. And I'm particularly going to presume upon our friendship. We've spent a lot of time together over the last year and a half. And so I should ask and become quite friendly working on this problem. So I should ask you easy questions, but I actually am going to ask you each a difficult question, put you on the spot a little bit, as is our wont up here. Let me start with Ambassador Lee first, and I'll state all three questions and then ask you all three to speak. Then I'll open up the floor microphones here, and anyone who has a question, if they just stand in front of these two microphones or those two microphones up there. Now, if you listen when I ask a question, it is actually a question. It ends with a little upward inflection. And if you would do the same when you ask your question, we would be grateful. Keep them short, and if you can, address them to a particular individual on the panel. If you don't choose to do so, I'll fan the question out. My question for you, Ambassador Lee, is would you tell us a little something about popular attitudes in the Republic of Korea towards the whole sunshine idea? Said differently, how much support does President Kim have for this policy, and what could change that support one way or another? For Ambassador Bosworth, I have the rare pleasure of having actually been to Pyongyang. I went with Bill Perry for 4 days, and it was a fascinating visit and the highest level American contact with the DPRK since 1953. And I suppose that makes me an instant expert on North Korea, like we're all experts on Vladimir Putin, who have seen him or met him. But Steve, you're probably a real expert. Tell us a little something about what's the DPRK game plan as you interpret it. Put yourself in their shoes. Are they thinking tactically, strategically, short-term, long-term? Where are they headed? And General Taleli, for you, what did you worry about most in your last month on duty? In other words, what should we be worried about seeing in the next year or so? Let me give you a menu. War, acquisition by North Korea of nuclear weapons, deployment of ballistic missiles, tests of ballistic missiles, chemical and biological weapons in their hands, implosion somehow of North Korea so that there are refugees, explosion of some kind so that there is terrorism or lashing out by a regime that feels most cornered. And what are the signs that you would find most worrying in the basic sense, security sense? Ambassador Lee.
Well, there is a broad spectrum of Koreans who support the Sunshine Policy or the President's engagement policy. In some sense, it is not a new policy. We've been moving toward that direction for last decade or so, for simple reason that, as I said earlier, no one wants to have another war. The only way we could deal with the situation is through a dialogue. Furthermore, everybody is truly concerned about the welfare of Koreans in North Korea. So all in all, he gets the support. But at the same time, most Koreans are a little bit tired after 55 years of division, and particularly tired after witnessing time after time the North Koreans break the promise, ignore the promise, and also utter the words of threat. Furthermore, many of them are irritated by some of the North Korean behaviors. And also there is apprehension that in negotiation, we may come out on the losing side and North Koreans may gain something for their end. And going a step further, some people worry that such important issue as reuniting separated families, or at least finding out whereabouts of these relatives and so on, may not take place. So there are some mixed feelings. But all in all, there are support for President Kim. But I think there is a tremendous political challenge ahead for President DJ Kim. That is how to really develop or engineer sufficient political consensus in South Korea to support his concrete effort in coming months and years to reach agreement with North Korea.
Well, I think anyone who would venture to reveal the North Korean game plan suffers from number of afflictions. I won't go into those. I think it's best to try to keep this answer very simple. I think its ultimate game plan is to do whatever it feels necessary in order to survive. I think that means that in any dialogue, as has been the case in their dialogue with us, they will try to gain as much as possible while giving as little as possible. They will attempt to maintain their leverage being in this case their military strength and particularly their missile programs. They will give those up very dearly. I think this is, however, their willingness to start talking to North Korea does not mean, or to South Korea, does not mean that we should expect capitalism with a Juche face and to emerge in North Korea. I don't think there is much understanding of the principles of the market, but I do think that we've seen over the last year or more evidence that North Korea is rebalancing its relationships with the world, probably in a somewhat delayed effort to compensate for the breakup of the Soviet Union and China's recognition diplomatically of South Korea. Their engagement with us, their efforts to establish diplomatic relations with European countries, with other Asian countries, a desire to join the Asian Regional Forum dialogue, an interest in joining international institutions, particularly international economic institutions. I think there has been a gradual realization on the part of many in the North Korean leadership that complete isolation no longer serves their interest. But they will not, therefore, immediately move to say, okay, capitalism is great, we're going to change our whole system. They have to continually balance, as does South Korea, what they're getting in return for what they're giving. This is not the decision of just one man. He may have been the final arbiter of the decision, but I suspect that his willingness to go forward is based on some consensus within the ruling elites of North Korea, and he will have to be attentive to maintaining that consensus at every step of the way.
I'll answer this question generally and then specifically if someone wants to explore it further. There were three things that I worried about every day I was in the Republic of Korea. And these are not in any order. First, that a provocation by the North would inadvertently escalate and through miscalculation escalate to crisis and potential conflict. The necessity to do everything that we could through diplomatic and other means to de-escalate as quickly as possible. An example of that was the Northern Lemon Line incident of June of '99, which could have escalated and was de-escalated as a function of the restraint of the armed forces and the government of the Republic of Korea. Miscalculation where weapons of high technology are used, once they start to be used, it's very difficult to stop. Secondly, I always thought about the weapons of mass destruction, the missiles and the chemical capability that we believe the North would use and has. And the last thing, and this really gets down to the tactical level, and that is did we as leaders in the Republic of Korea have our forces as trained and ready as possible that in the event of crisis and conflict, they would not only be able to deter, but to be able to fight and win if necessary as we were waiting for the requisite reinforcements. And that was not only in the last month, but it was every day of the 3.5 years that I spent there. And in my view, this was done as a function of not only the command, but the close relationship with the ROC government. And certainly when I think about the country team in the Republic of Korea, the ambassador and his staff were part of my team, and I felt that I was part of his team.
Thank you. Now we'll take questions from the floor. This gentleman first, please.
Hi, I'm Peter Ont, Dartmouth 98. My question is for Ambassador Bosworth, I suppose. You answered it halfway, but I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the North Korean diplomatic efforts and perhaps political decision-making in North Korea. You know, as the Westerners kind of have a hard time imagining what kind of a diplomatic corps they might have there. And do you think that there's a coherent and competent effort on their side in a diplomatic corps and in the government towards, you know, dealing with the West and the outside?
Yeah, thank you. I think I described about as much as I can about the North Korean diplomatic effort. They are, as I say, I think trying to rebalance their foreign policy and their relationships with the rest of the world. And they are meeting with some success. Their immediate objective seems to be to harvest as many benefits as soon as possible. And these relationships are all sort of predicated upon the forthcoming request for aid. The North Korean diplomatic effort is carried out by a relatively small number of people in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, however, is quite competent within the North Korean calculus of the world. There is at times a startling lack of familiarity with the world as it really exists. When I was at Cato trying to negotiate and finally succeeding in negotiating a supply agreement for the light water reactors, it became very evident that when I started talking about international finance or the international economic and financial institutions or the cash value of money that was spent to build the reactors now and what it would be worth if that was repaid 20 years ago from now at no interest, those were concepts that were not familiar to North Korea. On the other hand, in the area of nuclear construction, they have a lot of pretty well-trained people. I mean, their knowledge is a little out of date, but our technical people working with them found that there was a common language. The decision process is something that we understand only in the vaguest and dimmest fashion within North Korea. We have reason to believe that the most senior leadership is involved in all significant decisions, which in our system or in the South Korean system would be delegated to some extent. And obviously, given the way the system works, there is a great premium on playing it safe and not taking chances. I don't think you find much deviation on the part of North Korean diplomats from the letter of their instructions.
We've got a lot of questioners. Next is this gentleman up here.
Mark Dalton, a student at the Kennedy School. My question's for Ambassador Lee and Bosworth. There's an interplay in what's bringing parties to the table, the desperation of the North and the desire on the part of the U.S. and the Republic of Korea to deal with the issues of missiles and nuclear weapons. In the event that our leverage is reduced because the economic cooperation assistance we provide reduces that desperation, how would you deal with the issue that has brought us to the table, which is missiles and nuclear weapons?
Well, we have a general assumption that once you increase the contact, particularly the economic contact, for example, we have about 500 small companies now, South Korean companies operating in North in various forms. But suppose instead of 500, we have 5,000, and including some major firms. These will begin to change the North Korean perception of the world and North Korean behavior as well. And indeed, their own judgment as to what would be the most wise way to survive in the coming generation. So it's based on that expectation. However, at every step, we would like to check the development and safeguard our interest. And to do so, we need a very close coordination among our allies. So in some sense, you are taking a certain amount of risk. But again, we believe that the past examples elsewhere around the world show that if we continue toward that direction, we will gain a great deal of positive development in North Korea.
I agree very much with Ambassador Lee. I think one seeks, through what I described earlier, is greater economic connectedness to give North Korea a reason not to be provocative, a reason to find stability on the peninsula in its interest. In addition, I would add that as part of the Perry process and the Perry report and our intensive coordination efforts with South Korea, our approach, our joint approach, is clearly one of tied reciprocity, in which we may take an action, but in return for that, we expect the North Koreans to take action to meet some of our concerns. And our concerns are obviously in the area of their military threat, their weapons of mass destruction, their missile program, their refusal to allow separated families to have reunions. I mean, this is not a one-way street for the U.S. or, in my judgment, certainly not for the ROK. There has to be a return. We are democratically governed countries. And as Ambassador Lee indicated, no government in South Korea could sustain a policy which was all give and no get. There has to be a get. And certainly that's true of the United States, and it's a fundamental principle built into our coordinated strategy.
This gentleman up here.
Hi, my name is David Simpson of Boston, and I have a question for the General. If you could comment on some of the hardships endured by U.S. troops stationed over in Korea, and also briefly just the state of military readiness of the U.S. troops in Korea.
Well, first, let me address the readiness issue because there's been much said about it in the press. The fact is the services and the joint staff and chairman, because we are at the point of the spear, keep the readiness in the Republic of Korea among U.S. forces very high. High-tech equipment, top-line equipment, high levels of fill, and sufficient resources to do the necessary training, which is the glue that holds the units together and keeps them ready. I think as we think about the men and women who serve in Korea, we think about these great volunteers, men and women of character and courage, who in fact serve generally, and about 96% of them, in the Republic of Korea for 1 year without families. So they are deployed away from home for a year. Now that is a hardship in itself. Secondarily, and it is getting better each and every day and each and every year, secondarily, the investment into the infrastructure where our forces live has been inadequate over time. Therefore, our ability to modernize barracks primarily has improved, but it has improved slowly. Now, as a function of our construction programs being supported by the Republic of Korea government and by the Department of Defense, there has been, I think, a significant improvement in the last years, several years. However, it's going to take an amount of time to get us to where I think our troops are living in adequate conditions. At the same time, the men and women who serve in the Republic of Korea from all services spend an inordinate amount of time because of the training requirements in the field, where they're training their skills, and you can think about it in the context of if every 6 weeks in your class or in your organization, we do it every year, we change out 96% of the people, there is a tremendous turbulence and training requirement to keep organizations capable of performing in a collective way to do their tasks. In a real sense, though, the measurement of morale, if you were to think about recruiting and retention as a measurement of morale, those men and women serving in the Republic of Korea have some of the highest retention rates in any of the services. So we're not doing all that bad.
This gentleman over here.
My name is Paul Hodge. I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School. My question regards China and is directed to Professor Carter and/or Ambassador Bosworth and the role of China in this whole process. Specifically, number one, what is China's interest in regards to this process of the relationships between the South and the North? And number two, how or has China been used as a conduit or some type of partner in trying to foster better relationships?
Well, I'll take a hack at it, Steve. China, my belief, and I believe most Chinese officials whom you speak to will second this, that while U.S. and Chinese and ROK and Japanese interests are not identical on the Korean Peninsula, they overlap very substantially. And in particular, no one wants a war on the Korean Peninsula. That's not in China's interest. They'll agree to that and say that. Nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula are not in the interest of China. Ballistic missiles on the Korean Peninsula are not in the interests of China, in part, and an important part, because they are a principal impetus for theater missile defense and national missile defense in the United States. So if you go down the whole list of objectives which the United States, the ROK, and Japan are pursuing on these parallel coordinated tracks that Ambassador Bosworth described, and which seems to be having some effect, if you look at the objectives of those three countries, you'll see that they are quite similar to the objectives of China, and Chinese officials are pretty openly say that. And I believe, although I can't adduce complete proof of this, that China, in its own contacts with the DPRK, which it has, it goes back in history, there are party contacts, there are military-to-military contacts, I believe they make these points to the DPRK, that it's better to deal with this coordinated strategy. And a lot of that is inference, but I firmly believe it. Let me ask Steve Bosworth if he agrees.
I wouldn't add too much to that other than to say that in my earlier description of recent North Korean diplomatic activity, I should have also mentioned a rather visible effort to refurbish their relationships with China, which had remained somewhat frayed after China's decision to establish diplomatic recognition or diplomatic relations with South Korea. There has been an exchange of foreign ministers. The putative head of state of North Korea has visited Beijing. There are a lot of movement back and forth of the sort that we had not seen until 6 months ago, after a long dry spell. So I think that that development has operated probably to the benefit of South Korea's efforts to engage directly with North Korea. We know that China has been very supportive of that. And I think, as Ash Carter said, this is one place where all of our interests, while not identical, clearly converge.
This gentleman.
Yes, my name is Dan Fehlauer. I'm a student at the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences in German. And my question is addressed to Ambassador Lee and/or Ambassador Bosworth. And that is, how do you see the relation between North Korea and South Korea compared to the relationship between the former East Germany, or East Germany and West Germany in the 1980s? I think there was a strong, at first, not too many people in West Germany really expected that there would be reintegration. And then when the wall came down, and then all of a sudden it just seemed to happen, particularly because the East Germans really wanted it. And now it seems like perhaps that wasn't such a good idea, and there's some reluctance on both sides. So in North Korea, does the North Korean population want to be integrated with South Korea? Do the South Koreans want to be integrated with North Korea? Thanks.
Thank you. Ambassador Lee first, and then Ambassador Bosworth.
Well, we were the two countries which were divided in the aftermath of Second World War, and Germany achieved this unification in '89, and we became somewhat lonely. Now, immediately after the Berlin Wall fell down, we sent a large delegation from our ministry to write down almost all the details, because we thought we should learn a great deal of lesson from Germany. And we indeed have learned a great deal of lesson. But we found out the situation is so different. First of all, the population ratio. In Germany is 4-to-1. In Korea is 2-to-1. Economy. The West Germany was the strongest economy in Western Europe. East Germany was also doing quite well in Eastern zone. Third, East Germans were watching West German television many years. Now compared to that, North Korean economy is really in a very miserable situation. And North Koreans couldn't even hear South Korean radio. North Korean radios are produced with a fixed dial. So there's no real communication. So we face an extremely difficult situation. And we found out that unification cost in Germany was extremely high. That's why, as several people had mentioned, people have become much more cautious about thinking the immediate unification. However, we also learned other lessons. These things you don't plan. Things happen. Therefore, we are trying to prepare as much as possible for different contingencies. Second, finally, while unification cost is great, division cost is even greater. To maintain 1.5 million men in uniform and to spend all this money to sustain the system of confrontation, it's an extremely expensive venture. So if the opportunity presented itself for unification, we'll take it. By we, I mean both South and North. Whether it's, in what form, Ambassador Bosworth earlier mentioned that we have already declared that we have no intention to absorb North Korea into South. That's why we are saying that we would like to build a Commonwealth in which we could coexist, and together we could bring a new society, prosperous and fair.
I don't, again, have much to add to that. I think that the primary lesson is, as Ambassador Lee said, that you need to plan, but you can't really plan because you don't know much about timing and you don't know much about circumstances. In addition to the differences that he enumerated, there is a very important difference in that the forces, the sort of collective forces pushing for reunification in the Korean Peninsula are very strong if you look back over history. Germany was an organized entity for a brief moment of time compared to the 3,000 to 4,000 years in which Korea has existed as an organized nation state. So I think that when the time comes, there won't be very much hesitation. That's not to say that they will want to accelerate that time, but there won't be very much hesitation. Let me use this question to make a linkage to one of my other topics of interest, which is the strength of the South Korean economy. I think one of the long-term advantages of what South Korea is now doing economically, which is to basically begin developing a much more market-oriented, a much more open economic model, is that when unification comes, South Korea will not be able to finance this by itself over the decades that process will require. It will have to be a major borrower of capital in the international capital markets, private capital markets, because as the Germans learned, by and large, official foreign assistance for a reunification process ain't very forthcoming. So South Korea, in order to intermediate the funds that are going to be required is going to require, above all, a very transparent and very strong system of capital markets. Because people, private markets, private individuals and institutions who loan money to Korea are going to want to be very assured of how that money is being used. And the purpose for which it is intended is the purpose for which it is used. So I think there is a direct linkage, perhaps the most important linkage of all, and the most important way to prepare for unification is to make the Korean economy a strong economy so that when that moment comes, it can afford the cost.
This gentleman up here.
Good evening, gentlemen. I have two questions, the first of which is to Ambassador Lee and Ambassador Bosworth, and the second is just kind of an open question. The first one is...
How about, since you have two questions, why don't you pick an ambassador?
Okay, and the first one, Ambassador Lee. You had mentioned sort of a slower timing to the integration or what have you of North Korea, and I was wondering if you could kind of talk to the sort of the different tensions of the aging of the North Korean military, the growing apathy amongst the younger generation towards reunification, and also sort of, this was mentioned in the earlier question, but just the massive amount of effort that would go into and sort of the resistance in Korean society towards a very quick reunification. The second question deals with sort of the contention or the dark contention, and you can tell me if this is totally false or not, that the United States does have an interest in a divided Korea, and that's to achieve sort of its own geopolitical ends. And that's under the sort of the assumption that a united Korea would no longer require the presence of the U.S. military on its soil.
Okay, let's have Ambassador Lee answer the first question, Ambassador Bosworth the second, and General Tlali may have something to pitch in to add to answering the second question also.
Earlier, I mentioned the fact that the Koreans get a little tired after 55 years of division, and therefore the fervor for unification has also somewhat subsided. Nevertheless, we cannot underestimate the nationalism in a very positive sense. That is, when you talk about unification, it's not an abstract idea. It's reuniting the families, bring back the divided families together. So you cannot postpone the reuniting the family on the account of expense. So while I think sometimes people express their cautions and even what I call the tiredness, nevertheless, I think there is a strong and pervasive sentiment toward unification. And also, there's a strong feeling that we have to care for our fellow countrymen in the North. That's why large number of NGOs in Korea, the churches and other organizations are very active in terms of trying to help the North Korean population in many ways. So on the whole, I think there's no question about the very strong consensus in Korea in support of effort to bring the unification.
I don't accept the contention that the United States wants Korea to remain divided. I, to the contrary, believe that the United States is strongly supportive of a peaceful reunification of Korea. We're also supportive of the fact that the terms and conditions under which that comes about are the legitimate subject for discussion by Koreans, not by outsiders, including the United States. And we think this dialogue, therefore, over the very long term, offers the promise of creating structures within which Koreans can have those discussions. I think to the contrary of wanting Korea divided, we want Korea to be, from a geostrategic point of view, we want Korea to be as strong as possible. And we want Korea to be as big as possible. Not that we want them to expand their normal frontiers. I think Northeast Asia as a whole is much more stable prospectively with a unified Korea than it is with a divided Korea, even if there is a substantial lowering of tensions between the two Koreas. A divided Korea is, given the history of the peninsula, given its culture, is an artificial Korea. The only natural Korea is a unified Korea. But as I said, it's up to the Koreans to decide how they wish to bring that about peacefully. Now, it is, I think, undeniable that over the very long term, this is going to raise some questions for the United States and for our allies in the region as to how we wish to configure ourselves and position ourselves in the region over the long term. And in particular, it raises questions about the deployment of American forces. Kim Dae-jung has said that he wants American forces to remain even after reunification. That may be. I think that the subject of the future presence of American forces after Korean reunification is obviously up to the two governments that are in place at that time, and assuming that those are both democracies, the collective will of the two peoples. We clearly would not need what we have there now, but it might be that we would decide that some continued deployment of American military forces is useful. But these are very difficult strategic questions. We, for our part, aren't terribly good at long-term planning, to put it mildly. And we tend not to really look at these issues until they become very apparent and very near-term issues. So I think this is a place in which, among many places, academia can provide us with some grist for our mills and some intellectual capital for the future strategic reflections of American policymakers.
I agree with what Steve Bosworth said. I personally would make the argument for the desirability for the region of a continuing U.S. presence on the peninsula in this hypothetical situation. I believe that it's not just good for the United States, but good for the region, for the U.S. to be in this region militarily. There is no NATO. There are no pre-existing structures. Much of the past is not yet put behind the antagonists of mid-century in that region of the world. And so as a counterbalance to tendencies that could easily develop in that region, I think the American presence is a good thing. And if Japan is the only host to U.S. forces, I think that puts Japan in a difficult situation. So for that reason, assuming nothing else changes between now and this hypothetical time when reunification takes place, I think if all else being equal, and a continuing American presence is a good thing, and I think that's what President Kim was saying. Over here, please.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. My name is Rahul Rahatke. I'm a student at the college. My question has to do with something Ambassador Lee said earlier about a Commonwealth system of unification. And my question basically is, what is the conditions that South Korea will accept for any kind of unification? What will be the level of democracy necessary? And do you see any steps being taken now or in the future to ensure a democratic North Korea?
Well, we try to think the future development in several stages. If everything goes well at the summit in June and in the following meetings, we can sharply upgrade exchanges and cooperation. More South Korean companies will operate in North Korea, will participate in the development of basic infrastructures in North Korea, such as building harbors, roads, and so on. If this continues, we will begin to develop a common economic zone to really have this type of large-scale economic cooperations by the private sector as well as between two governments. We need a number of agreements, such as investment guarantee, for example. So through this process, we will be able to develop what we consider to be an economic community. We remember the development of not quite same, but a similar type in Western Europe after the Second World War. So if we were to have this type of economic community and cultural community, so on, we think we could have the basics for building a commonwealth. By commonwealth, we meant the existence of two different political structures under one roof. Now, you asked me, at that stage, is North Korea a democracy? Not necessarily. Now, we have, at the moment, quite cordial relationship with, for example, China. China is under the communist rule. But every year we expand our economic and social ties and exchanges. For example, not long ago we had the World Cup preliminary match between China and Korea in Seoul, and 5,000 Chinese turned up. These are kind of things. Let's say 10,000 South Koreans go up to Pyongyang to watch the match, and 10,000 North Koreans come down to South Korea. So we would like to develop a Commonwealth scheme as a second stage. As for the final stage, it's better to leave it unspecified, because by specifying the final format, you can really make the whole process more difficult. We should better leave this, and when we reach the second stage, we can discuss this between two governments, between two people, and perhaps between all the organizations and NGOs involved.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid that's going to have to be the last question. Let me thank you all for coming this evening. Watch your newspapers for the election results. Wait till June, see if there's a summit. Get excited about the World Cup coming up in a couple of years. And I think you'll agree that this is one of the most fascinating, but also the most dangerous parts of the world. And I'd like to thank our three speakers, not only for elucidating this fascinating and dangerous part of the world, but for what they do to keep it from being dangerous. Thank you very much.